Hi, this is Jaya. In this video, we shall see the summary of The Archetypes of Literature by Northrop Frye. Though there are many criticisms and critical approaches, here Northrop Frye says that analyzing literature based on the backdrop of the rituals and myths of each religion, each society, will give you a better understanding of the text. And therefore, he says that we should understand the rituals and myths of each customs. And this essay he has divided into three parts, and the first part deals with the concept of archetypal criticism, and second part shows light on the inductive method of analyzing a text, and the third part focuses on the deductive method of analysis, and all these methods fall under structural criticism. Now, what is archetype? Archetype means an original idea or pattern of something, and others are all copies. There is an original idea, and from that we have copied. And archetypal approach is interpreting the text based on a cultural pattern. And this cultural pattern, he says, is based on the myths and rituals of a race or a nation or a social group. And these myths and rituals, if they are explored properly, then the meaning and message of the text will be understood in a better light. And in recent times, this approach has gained a lot of popularity, and particularly James George Fraser and Carl Gustav Jung. They are the two great authorities who have contributed to the development of archetypal approach. Fraser's The Golden Bough has made a study of magic, religion, and myth of different races. And Jung is a psychologist associated with Freud. His collective consciousness is a major theory of Jung. And according to Jung, even a civilized man unconsciously preserves the ideas, concepts, and values of life which were cherished by his distant forefathers. And he says that only such ideas are actually expressed in society or a race in their myth and ritual. And creative writers, they use these myths in their works, and critics analyze these myths and rituals to discover more about the text. That is, that mythological patterns will help us to have a better understanding of the text. This kind of critical analysis of the text is called as archetypal criticism. T.S. Eliot has used this mythological pattern in his creative works, and Wasteland is a very good example of this. And here, Northrop Frye analyzes all the myths. He is not analyzing any particular myth in a work, but he is doing it in a general, because he feels that mythological patterns are there in general in all the writers' works. And he uses, literary criticism is something which analyzes and interprets text. And this literary criticism and its theories and techniques, he says, can be taught. But literature is something which cannot be taught, because literature is something which should be felt and enjoyed. And he feels that there are two types of literary criticism. One is a meaningful criticism, another is a meaningless criticism. A meaningless criticism will not help a reader in understanding the knowledge of the work of the literature. And this kind of criticism will give you only the background information about a work. Thing is, this meaningless criticism can even distract the readers away from the literature. And he says the literature is actually a part of humanities, and in humanities, literature definitely includes philosophy and history. Because philosophy and history, that knowledge provides a kind of pattern of understanding literature. And philosophy and history are two major tools for interpreting literature, and archetypal criticism is based on philosophy and history of a people. Therefore, he says that archetypal criticism is a meaningful criticism. A criticism which focuses only on the analysis of a text will not give you much information about the background of the text, and this is called as formalistic or structural criticism. This will definitely help the readers to understand the pattern of the text, but how that pattern was evolved will not be understood unless you have the background information, which may be called as the historical criticism. Structural criticism will help the reader to understand the pattern of the text, and historical criticism will make the readers understand it more better. Archetypal criticism is a synthesis of both cultural criticism and historical criticism. Science, whether literary criticism is a science or not is an argument here. He says science generally explores nature, and different branches of science explore different aspects of nature. Like physics explores matter and natural forces on the universe, and physics and astronomy, they gained their scientific significance and were accepted as a branch of science during the Renaissance time itself. And chemistry was accepted as a science in 18th century, and biology in the 19th century, and social sciences in the 20th century. Similarly, he says the literary criticism is also a systematic analysis, and therefore it should be considered as a science. And he says that among the tools of criticism, there are two methods. One is structural criticism, another one is historical criticism. For any particular truths in a work, Frye says that everything is drawn from a general truth. For example, in Shakespeare's Othello, we find that jealousy leads to destruction. So this is something which the reader derives from that book. And this is called as inductive method of analysis under structural criticism. And an author should not express his personal emotions and comments, but he should be absolutely objective in his work. And a critic will find out whether the author is free from textual interference. This is also a sort of a psychological approach, and this method of criticism helps the readers in understanding an author's personal symbols, images and myths which he incorporates in his works. At times the author may do it without even his consciousness, like unconsciously he may include the myths and symbols in his work, and the critic has to find out such things. And the second type of criticism, called the historical criticism, a critic interprets the birth of a text, like how this text was evolved, what made the writer to write the text, and he will come out with the social and cultural demands of a society in a particular period, because it is the social and cultural milieus which are the causes responsible for the creation of the work. And the historical critic plays a major role in understanding the text. If both structural criticism and historical criticism are a necessity in archetypal criticism, we should understand that neither can be dispensed with. But either of the alone also cannot explain the work completely, because a historic critic discovers common symbols and images being used by different writers in their works, and he comes to a conclusion that there is a common source from which the writers have derived these symbols, images and myths. For example, C is a common symbol used by writers for many years, and therefore C can be considered as an archetypal symbol. Not only symbols, images and myths, but also genres are said to be archetypal. For example, the genre of drama originated from Greek religion. Thus, the historical inductive method of criticism helps the readers in understanding all these, that is symbols, images, myths and even the genre. Archetypal criticism dissects and analyzes these symbols, images and mythologies used by the writers in their works, and these symbols, mythologies and rituals have their origin in the primitive myths, rituals, folklore and cultures. Such primitive factors, according to Jung, lie buried in the collective unconscious, which may otherwise be called as racial memory of the people. Since a writer is also a part of a race, and what lies in his unconscious mind is expressed in his work in the form of myths, rituals, symbols and images. In archetypal criticism, under the reductive method of analysis, a critic will elucidate a text and he moves from a particular truth to the general truth, which will lead us to where the writer got the idea of his text. Now, archetypal criticism is an all-inclusive term, because it will involve the efforts of all the specialists. An editor is needed to clean up the text, a rhetorian will analyze the narrative pace, a philologist will scrutinize the choice and significance of the words chosen by the writer, a literary social historian will study the evolution of the myths and rituals. In an archetypal study, like you take Hamlet, the anthropologist will trace the source of the drama to Hamlet to the legend who was described by Saxo, a 13th century Danish historian, in his book entitled Danes Gestodanarum. And he will further trace the source of the drama to nature myths, which were actually in vogue in the Norman conquest period. Thus, an anthropologist makes a threadbare analysis of the origins of Hamlet under archetypal criticism. Literature, he says, is like music and painting. Rhythm is very important for music and pattern is important for painting. Now, in literature also we have rhythm and pattern in the form of images, forms and words. In literature, rhythm is the narrative, and this narrative presents all the events and episodes in a sequence and hastens the action. Pattern literature conveys the meaning of the text, and therefore when you are producing an effective work, that work of literature should have both rhythm, that is narrative, and pattern, that is meaning. Now the world of nature is governed by rhythm, and nature also has a natural cycle, that is that is spring, winter, autumn and summer. Now this rhythm is there in the world of the animals, in the world of the minerals, in the world of the vegetables and in the human world. For example, the mating of animals and birds takes place rhythmically in a particular season every year, and therefore we can even say that mating is a ritual. And this ritual is not performed frequently but rhythmically after a long gap, and it has a meaning, and the meaning is reproduction of the species. In the world of nature also, rituals are rhythmic. Crops are planted and harvested rhythmically every year, and they have their own seasons. At the time of planting and harvesting, sacrifices and offerings are made, and they also have a meaning. That is, the meaning is fertility and consummation of life. In human world, rituals are performed voluntarily and they have their own significance. Works of literature have their origins in such rituals. An archetypal critic discovers and explains them. He explains the rhythms of the ritual and what are the basis of literature in general. Patterns are derived from a reader's epimonic moments. That is, how the writer gets the concept for his work in a moment of inspiration, and he looks into the heart of things. Then he expresses what he has perceived in the forms of proverbs, riddles, commandments and ethnological folk tales. Such things add to the narrative of the writer in his work. A writer expresses what he has perceived, and for this he uses myths either deliberately or unconsciously. And it is the work of the critic to discover the archetypes, the myths in a work, and explains the pattern in the work. And therefore, both pattern and rhythm are the basic and major components of a work. And the four phases of the myth are the central significance and narrative of a work. It can be a god or a demigod or a superhuman or a legend. Now, Fraser and Jung contend that in the development of a myth, the central figure or central significance is the most important factor, and many writers have accepted this view. Now, Fry classifies these myths into four categories. The first one is the dawn, spring and birthplace. Here, the myth deals with the birth of the hero, his revival and resurrection, defeat of the powers of darkness and death, and the subordinate characters are father and the mother. And such myths are the archetypes of romance and the rhapsodic poetry. The second is the zenith, summer and marriage or triumph phase. In this phase, they are myths of apathesis, that is the act of an ordinary person being raised to the rank of God, of sacred marriage and of entering into paradise. And the subordinate characters in these myths are the companions and the bride, and such myths are the archetypes of comedy, pastoral and idyll. Here comedy means a peaceful ending, a good ending. And third is the sunset, autumn and death phase. Here the myth deals with the fall of the hero, a dying god, violent death, sacrifice and the hero's isolation. Here the subordinate characters are traitor and the siren, and such myths are the archetypes of tragedy and elegy. And fourth is the darkness, winter and dissolution phase. Here the myths deal with the triumph of these powers. That is the myth of floods, the return of the chaos, and the defeat of the hero are examples of this chaos. And the subordinate characters are the ogre and the witch, and these myths are the archetypes of satire. Now, in quest myth, the hero goes to find out the answer of his question, to find out the truth or something else. And this type of myth recurs in all religion. For example, the Messiah myth in a quest myth of a holy grail, that is, it's a Christian myth. This is in the last part of the wasteland. Now, sacred scriptures of all religion have their own myths. For an analysis of the archetypes of myths, a critic has to make a study of the genres, and from the genres he can further come down and elucidate the text in terms of myths. This type of dissension in criticism is called the deductive method of analysis. In this way, a critic can analyze from myths how a drama or a lyric or an epic has been evolved. Now, there is a close relationship between literary criticism and religion. A literary critic considers God as an archetype of man who is portrayed as a hero in a work. For example, God is a character in the story of Paradise Lost or the Bible. But the critic will deal with him, that is God, and consider God only as a human character. Criticism does not deal with any actuality, but with what is conceivable and possible. Similarly, religion is not associated with scientific actuality, but with how things look like. Literary criticism works on conceivability. Same way, religion functions on conceivability. There can be no place of scientific actuality in both, but what is conceived is acceptable by all. And both in religion and literary criticism, an ephemony is at work. It is a revelation of God or truth, and it is a profound insight. And it originates from the subconscious, from the dreams. In human life, there is a cycle of waking and dreaming, that is sleeping, being awake and sleeping. And in nature also we have a cycle of light and darkness, that is day and night. Now, waking and dreaming and light and darkness are two antithetic factors which bring about ephemony in a person. Because during the day, the man develops fear and frustration, but in the night, in his dreams, his libido becomes a strong force of life and awakens, and he resolves to achieve. It is the antithesis which resolves the problems and misunderstandings of man and makes him perceive truth both in religion and in literary criticism. Now, both art and religion aim at perfection. In art, it is achieved through dreaming, that is through imagination, and in religion, it is through visualization, that is imagining what will happen if what you have prayed to God comes in reality. And therefore, perfection can be achieved in literary criticism by the archetypal critic through an analysis of the comic and the tragic vision. In the comic vision of life, in the human world, it is presented as a community, or a hero is portrayed as a representative of the desires of the readers. And the archetypal images are symposium, communion, order, friendship, and love. Marriage or some equivalent consummation belongs to the comic vision of life. In the tragic vision in the human world, it is tyranny or anarchy or an individual or an isolated person or a leader with his back to his followers or a bullying giant of romance or a deserted or betrayed hero. In addition to these, there will be a harlot or a witch or other varieties of Jung's terrible mother in the tragic vision of life. In the comic vision in a myth of animal world, it will be presented as a community of domesticated animals, generally a flock of sheep or a lamb or a gentler bird like dove. The archetypal images are pastoral images. In the tragic vision of life in the animal world, they are beasts, birds of prey, wolves, vultures, serpents, dragons, and so on. In the comic vision of life in the vegetable world of myth, there is a garden, a grove or park, or a tree of life with full of flowers and fruits, or a rose or a lotus. The example of archetypes of Arcadian images are Marvel's Green World and Shakespeare's forest comedies. In the tragic vision of life, in the vegetable world of myth, there is a sinister forest like the one in Milton's Camus or at the opening of Dante's Inferno, or a heath or wilderness or a tree of death. In the comic vision of life in the mineral world of myth, there is a city or one building or temple or one stone, normally a glowing precious stone. They are presented as luminous or fiery. The The example of the archetype of image is a starlit dome. In the tragic vision of life, the mineral world of a myth is seen in the terms of deserts, rocks, and ruins, or of geometrical images like the cross. In the comic vision of life, in the unformed world of a myth, there is a river, traditionally fourfold, which influenced the Renaissance image of the temperate body with its four humors. In the tragic vision of life, this world usually becomes the sea as the narrative myth of dissolution, and it is often a flood myth. The combination of the sea and the beast images gives us the Leviathan and similar waterborne monsters. Frye introduces W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium as an example of the comic vision, where it is represented by the city, the tree, the bird, the community of sages, the geometrical gyre, and the detachment from the cyclic world. It is either tragic or comic vision of life which determines the interpretation of a symbol or myth, says Frye. And in conclusion, we can find that here Northrop Frye has established the validity of the archetypal approach and its relevance in the elucidation of a text. Criticism is also creative. An archetype critic discovers the meaning of a text and the motives of a character. No human endeavor is independent, and the work of an archetypal critic is inclusive of formalistic criticism or structural criticism and historical criticism. Both Fraser and Jung opened up new vistas in archetypal or mythical criticism, and Frye has obviated the impediments in the appreciation of a text. In mythical criticism, both the inductive method and the deductive method are effective tools, and neither can be dispensed with, according to Frye. If one method explains a text based on derivation of a general truth from the particular, the other method does it the other way round. Archetypal approach to a text has contributed to the establishment of a systematic and comprehensive concept of literary criticism. If you have anything more to add on to what I've said, please write it in the comment box, like the video, share it with your friends, and if you have not subscribed my channel, please subscribe and support. Thank you.